Will, you're going to cue me?
You bet. Need just a second.
Thanks.
Okay, you can go ahead and start.
Good evening, and thank you for joining tonight's Drug Policy Alliance exclusive telephone town hall with DPA's Executive Director, Dr. Ethan Nadelmann. Tonight we'll be discussing the midterm elections and the road ahead as DPA continues its work to reform drug policy throughout the nation. My name is Asha Bandele, and I will be the moderator for this event, which will begin in just a moment. Before we begin, though, a few quick points I'd like to make. Right now, we're in the process of dialing out to thousands of DPA members all across the country, so please just stay on the line, and we'll be hearing from Ethan shortly. And it would serve us all for me to mention here that Ethan did a very, very brilliant TED Talk in Brazil last month, and it's available for you to listen to at drugpolicy.org/TED. That's drugpolicy.org/TED. Thank you for your time and your support, and we also do want to hear from you tonight. So if you would like to ask a question at some point during the discussion, please press 0 on your telephone keypad, and you'll be connected directly with one of our volunteer operators. Again, please press 0 to ask a question. And if you are just joining us, good evening and welcome to tonight's exclusive town hall with Drug Policy Alliance's Executive Director, Dr. Ethan Nadelmann. My name is Asha Bandele, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. We're going to begin in just a moment. I want to thank you for joining us. Right now, we're in the process of dialing out to tens of thousands of DPA members like you nationwide. So stay on the line, and we'll hear from Dr. Nadelmann in just a moment. And let me just also share with you that Ethan did give a brilliant TED Talk on the drug war, and it's available at drugpolicy.org/TED. If you want to ask a question at any point during this discussion, please press 0 at any time, and we will be able to see your name, and you'll be connected with one of our operators. Again, please press 0 at any time to ask a question. In order to continue this all-important work to reform drug policy across the country, we do need your help. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ethan Nadelmann. Good evening, Ethan.
Thank you, Asha. Thanks for doing this with me. So for all of you listening, first of all, thanks for supporting DPA. I really appreciate it. So my colleagues thought it would be a good idea for me to just give a kind of briefing about where things stand on drug policy reform and the last election and all of that. And I'll tell you, I was awfully nervous until Election Day. I mean, we did not really know. We thought we'd win in D.C. on the marijuana decrim initiative, marijuana legalization initiative. We weren't sure it was going to happen in Oregon or Alaska. We were involved in some other stuff, a sentencing reform initiative in California, bail reform in New Jersey. And I have to say that the downside of losing in Oregon especially, and maybe Alaska, was probably greater in some respects than the upside of winning, in part because of how it would have affected the entire national frame. I mean, if we had lost in Oregon, people would have said, oh, Washington and Colorado were just outliers and the tide's turning, and maybe the Obama administration would have started to backtrack and people would have started to pull away. But in fact, that's not what happened, right? What happened was Oregon won and won big. It actually got a slightly bigger percentage of the vote, about 56%, than Colorado and Washington did 2 years ago. That was all the more remarkable because this is a non-presidential election year where young people historically are less likely to show up. So we knew it was going to be a heavy lift to win it this year. Alaska, I mean, only 1/6 of registered voters are Democrats, 1/3 are Republicans, half are independent, very much a red state. So, and the polling there is notoriously unreliable, so we had no idea what was going to go down there. D.C., we were a little nervous. We thought we were going to win, but we were concerned by some of the early polling on stuff that was going on. Florida, medical marijuana, and I should say that in all these states, I mean, whether you're looking at Oregon and Alaska, Florida medical marijuana, Guam, which legalized medical marijuana on election day, D.C., DPA, we have always been involved in the drafting of all these initiatives, whether we're playing a lead role or a support role. We ended up playing a leadership role together with local allies in Oregon and in D.C. We helped our allies, the Marijuana Policy Project, and local activists in Alaska with the drafting and some money in Alaska that we think helped take it over the edge. In Florida, we helped them draft the initiative, and we did the best we could on the fundraising there, but that was a very, very highly professional campaign, and we had to prioritize other places. In Guam, Pacific Island territory of the U.S., we helped with the drafting there. And apart from the marijuana issue in California, there was a very important sentencing reform, prison reduction ballot initiative that we also helped with a bit on the drafting and the funding. And in New Jersey, and another important sentencing reform initiative to reform the bail industry. There we took on the big bad bail bond industry and we beat them. So coming out of this stuff, now that I no longer need to worry about the prospect of losing, it's fun to relish the benefits of winning. The fact that in both Alaska and Oregon, the marijuana initiatives got more votes, I believe, than any of the statewide candidates. In New Mexico, where we had decrim initiatives on in both Santa Fe County and in Bernalillo County, where Albuquerque is, we won those big, and remarkably, not just in Santa Fe County, which is pretty liberal, but also in Bernalillo County, where Albuquerque is, we actually got more votes than Governor Susana Martinez did in her reelection campaign. So I think what we demonstrated is that the wind is ever more at our backs when it comes to reforming marijuana laws and to some extent on reducing prison populations as well. I think we're moving into 2016 with a lot of momentum. People have been asking me what's up next, and I'd say that probably the big campaign for 2016 is going to be California. It's going to be legally, regulating and taxing marijuana in California like it's been done in the 4 states. It's going to be the biggest, most complex campaign ever. I would keep my eye on Maine and Nevada as the 2 most likely places where we'll see legalization on the ballot apart from California. I'd say that Massachusetts and Arizona have a shot if the polling stays strong there. We have some allies in Missouri who are eager to put something on the ballot there. We'll have to see how the polling is there. And as for medical marijuana, when you look at the states that have the ballot initiative process but have not yet legalized medical marijuana, I'd say keep your eye on Arkansas, which got close a few years ago but didn't quite make it, and Ohio, which is kind of you'd think it should have done it by now. Hard to know what's up next in Florida. A lot of big decisions to be made there. And, and before I just stop right now, I'd just say, Drug Policy Alliance, we've played a leadership role in this stuff going right back to 96. I mean, we probably played the key role in half the states that have legalized medical marijuana as well as those that have legalized marijuana more broadly. We've also been deeply involved in sentencing reform. But, we help drive, shape, influence, fundraise, organize, all of that stuff. But I also got to give credit to local activists who sort of pop up in these states and get in touch with us and say, we want your help. And then we got a judgment to make. Are we going to invest big time in what's going on in this state? And when we see the right team of people and the polling looks good, that's when we jump. So, Asha, let me stop there and turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Ethan. And I actually have a few questions I want to ask to sort of take us behind the scenes, but we have so many questions coming up in the queue. I want to actually bring one of our callers online right now, and so that would be Richard Basford from California. Go ahead and ask your question. Your mic is live.
Okay. Yes, hi. I'm interested in marijuana because it's involves so many people, and but also I'd like to legalize all drugs because, again, too many people are in jail, and I want them to all be treated as drug detox patients instead of criminals. And I guess I'd love to have the I don't know if that's the question, but are we also working on legalizing all drugs? Because marijuana is the important one, I agree, but the other ones are important too.
Thanks
yeah,
so
well,
much,
I'll tell you.
Richard.
Yeah, what I would say to you, Richard, is the following, which is that, Drug Policy Alliance, we represent a spectrum of opinion on this stuff. And it goes from the people who, like you, want to legalize all drugs to those people who are uncomfortable fully legalizing almost any drugs except perhaps marijuana, but who want to roll back the drug war, treat addiction as a health issue, et cetera. So we represent that spectrum of opinion. Our mission is to reduce the role of criminalization and the criminal justice system in drug control to the maximum extent possible while still protecting public safety and health, right? And what that means concretely is that taking marijuana entirely out of the criminal justice system, taxing it, regulating it, letting people grow a small amount for their own use, in their backyard gardens, is obviously the policy with marijuana. The second element of this is ending the criminalization of simple drug possession. Our view is that nobody should lose their freedom, their job, or anything simply for the use or possession of a drug so long as they're not causing harm to other people. For shorthand, we call it the quote-unquote Portugal model because Portugal has more or less done this. And the third element of what we're trying to do is that provide the means by which people who are absolutely determined to get their drugs, whether they're heavy users or addicts or just determined to get it, that they can get their drugs from legally regulated sources. In a way, it's looking at what the European countries have been doing with allowing heroin addicts to get legal pharmaceutical heroin from a clinic if they're unable or unwilling to stop in any other way. And finding the ways to scale that up so that we diminish the black market, diminish the prison populations and all that. And I think the bigger frame for all our work is we just want to reduce incarceration in this country and around the world. But, part of what drives me and most of my colleagues is our sense of shame and embarrassment and injustice at living in an otherwise great nation that has less than 5% of the world's population, but almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population, and where the war on drugs has been a major, if not the dominant factor, driving that multi-decade policy of mass incarceration. Now, the other thing I can tell you is, for better or for worse, there is no slippery slope from marijuana legalization to other drug legalization. If you look at the public opinion polls, even as support for legalizing marijuana has gone up from maybe a third of the country 10 years ago to a little over 50% now, we've not seen any real increase in support for legalizing other drugs. If you look at the Netherlands, where they've had quasi-legalization for 30 years, you don't see support for fully legalizing the other drugs. What you do see is support for ending the criminalization of drug possession and treating addiction as a health issue, right? So what I will tell you is that, Drug Policy Alliance, we're not just about marijuana reform. That's about 30 to 40% of what we do. But the other third of our work is trying to reduce the prison populations and changing drug policies with respect to the other drugs. And the last third is treating addiction primarily as a health issue and drug use as a health issue. That's why we took the lead role nationwide in the late 90s, early 2000s in legalizing needle exchange programs to reduce HIV/AIDS. And it's now why Drug Policy Alliance is the leading organization in the country trying to reduce overdose fatalities involving heroin and pharmaceutical drugs, both by making the antidote naloxone available and by passing what are called 911 Good Samaritan laws so that people who witness an overdose can call 911. So put it this way, in summary, we're committed to squeezing every ounce of criminalization out of drug control policy up to the point where we think that doing so would actually endanger broader public health and safety.
That's good, Ethan, and it's a great segue. I really want to sort of bring everybody into this conversation with a poll question, which everyone can participate in. Before I tell you that, if you do have a question, you can press 0 on your keypad, so we will see, you'll be connected with an operator and we can get your question in there. But here's a poll question that everybody can participate in. What issues most drive you to support drug policy reform? If it's marijuana reform, please press 1 on your keypad now. If it is criminal justice reform and ending mass incarceration, please press 2. If it is, if you're concerned about health and harm reduction, please press 3. If you are standing here for personal sovereignty and liberty, please press 4. And press 5 if all those reasons matter to you equally. So again, that's 1 for marijuana reform, 2 for criminal justice and mass incarceration reforms, health and harm reduction, press 3, press 4 for personal sovereignty and liberty, and 5 if all of the above matter to you equally. And as you're doing that, let me go ahead and take another question, this one from Helen in Illinois. Let me bring your mic live, Helen, and ask you to ask your question, please. You're live now. Helen in Illinois, are you with us?
My concern
your mic is
yes. My concern is how can we eliminate the ability of employers to try to screen you to say, well, you've consumed cannabis in some form, and now you no longer have the option to be an employee.
That's good.
Drug screening, that's a huge problem.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something. It's a great question. It's a very tough challenge. We've thought about including a provision in our ballot initiatives on marijuana reform, and I think that was in the California initiative in 2010, that would prohibit employers from firing people simply for testing positive because they smoked a joint over the weekend or the evening before, right? That's one of the great harms in all this, that marijuana continues to show up in your urine days after you may have gotten high. And what we found so far is that putting in a provision like that, it's risky in the sense that it may cause us to lose the ultimate initiative because the public doesn't fully get it, or it may cause our opposition, business owners and others, to get all riled up around this initiative. So as a matter of principle, we're looking every which way we possibly can. I think as marijuana is increasingly legalized and as people are more and more conversant with it, I think that we're going to see drug testing in the workplace increasingly diminish. And at the same time, we're focused on trying to find ways. I mean, everybody agrees that an employer should be able to fire basically somebody who's impaired at work, that there's no excuse for being impaired at work or being impaired on the roads. On the other hand, firing somebody just for what they did the evening before is not right. So we're going to be looking for opportunities to take those cases on. Sometimes it's going to involve when government's the employer, where there's more of a constitutional issue involved, and just keep pushing on this front until nobody's getting fired simply for what they did in the privacy of their own home and in a way that doesn't affect the workplace.
Thank you so much for that, Ethan. And let me share the poll results. The overwhelming majority of you, nearly half, said all of the reasons were of equal importance to you. But right behind that, about 30% of you are really here because of criminal justice and mass incarceration, followed by marijuana law reform, harm reduction, and then personal sovereignty. Thank you for participating in that poll. And let me turn to you, Ethan, with a question, because there's sort of no other way to say it than that the Democrats were sort of trounced on state and federal levels in this election. Do you have a sense of what that means for drug policy reform going into the 2016 elections, or even the implementation of the victories that we saw on November 4th?
Actually, it's a great question. I mean, I think, first of all, it means that, in a way, the victories for drug policy reform, both on sentencing reform and marijuana reform, were all the more impressive. That in a political climate where Republicans were dominant, these things nonetheless won. So I think it attests to sort of both the strength of our campaigns as well as the growing bipartisan nature of support for reform. It's worth pointing out that marijuana legalization and medical marijuana won even in some conservative districts in some of these states, and keeping in mind that Alaska is basically a red state where the Democratic Senator Begich was defeated in his effort for re-election. So, we really are crossing over in very some important ways. I do think, though, that the ways in which the Republicans sort of swamp the Democrats in some respects is going to make drug policy reform more difficult. What we've typically seen is that, with some notable exceptions, Democrats disproportionately support varying elements of drug policy reform, and the Republicans disproportionately are opposed. You look on Capitol Hill where 70-80% of congressional Democrats will vote to, get the federal government out of the way when it comes to medical marijuana or marijuana reform, but where the Republicans, you're lucky to get maybe 20% of them. Now, there's a few exceptions. Once in a while, you get a Republican leader like Gary Johnson, the former libertarian-minded governor of New Mexico, or Senator Rand Paul, who's been a great ally of ours, or you look at the state of New Hampshire, Republican legislature has been very good. But what I say is it means that we're going to have to get all the better at doing our bipartisan and nonpartisan work on this front. You know, in Florida, for example, you know, the medical marijuana initiative got almost 58% of the vote, but Florida is the only state in the country that requires 60%. Also, Rick Scott, who's been a real, you know, drug war type guy. You know, it's going to make it a lot harder to do the right thing in a state like that. So, yeah, it's a challenge, but I think it's testament to the fact that drug policy reform movement is getting ever better at this kind of bipartisan work.
Yeah, no, I'm hearing that. And I want to go to one of our callers from Idaho, Dakota Diener. Your microphone is now live. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. Yeah, I'm wondering if Alliance is working at all on the federal level to try and decriminalize marijuana as well, and if so, how are you going about it?
Yeah, I mean, basically, on the federal level, the key thing right there is basically been these congressional votes in the House of Representatives on getting the federal government to pull back. And a year ago, we just assumed that there was no hope on Capitol Hill, and especially with the Republicans in control of the House of Representatives. And yet, to our pleasant surprise, a number of amendments on House bills, Speaker of the House Boehner let them go to a floor vote, and we got 70-90% of Democrats, we got 40 to 50 Republicans, and we actually ended up winning in the House of Representatives. So a couple of those issues were around the legalization of hemp. There were a couple about, ordering the Justice Department to get out of the way and not spend any money going after marijuana reforms in the states that had legalized it. There was another one about telling the Treasury Department to let the marijuana industry have access to legal banks. So we actually saw some real progress on the marijuana front. And unfortunately, it didn't move through in the Senate, but for reasons unrelated to marijuana reform. It had a lot more to do with the bigger budgetary issues. So I think our traction on decrim is in the federal level is mostly focused on marijuana. With respect to the decriminalization of the possession of other drugs, there it's much more an effort being undertaken at the local level. And there I would say keep your eye on Washington, D.C., which is the only jurisdiction in the country where a majority of voters say that they would favor ending the criminalization of all drug possession. And also keep your eye on places like King County, Washington, Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the police are increasingly committed to a policy of not putting people into jail for simple drug possession. San Francisco's been making real strides in that front. We're optimistic that Albany, New York, which has some very thoughtful leadership, is going to move forward. But that stuff's going to have to bubble up at the local level first.
Thanks for that, Ethan. And now I am going to Frank from Texas. Frank, your microphone is live. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, I had told him that I've done prison time here in Texas. It's like a prison state, and in the last 8 years I've worked in the prison system as a drug counselor, and I'm all for the legalization. And I was just wondering what's going on with Texas. My colleagues think I'm crazy because I want it legalized, and I said it needs to be in the hand of it'll stop worse crimes, and it should be in the hands of the medical world, not the judicial world.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you, we got a growing number of allies in Texas. There's some good Texas-based organizations, both progressive and conservative. There's a group called Right on Crime that's a national organization, but driven by a very talented fellow, Mark Levin, who's organizing conservatives calling for sentencing reform. Drug Policy Alliance is working with our allies, Marijuana Policy Project, as well as local activists to try to advance medical marijuana legislation as well as the decriminalization of marijuana. I met by chance yesterday with Beto O'Rourke, who is the congressman from El Paso, who first made a name for himself as the city councilman who called for a major change in drug policy. And he's increasingly interested in stirring up the issue on the border and in terms of the U.S. relationship with Mexico and Central America and advancing things there. We got some good allies at the Baker Institute at Rice University also working on this issue. So Texas is going to be a long slog. I mean, no question about that. I was pleasantly surprised when Governor Rick Perry showed up on a drug policy panel at the famous World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland earlier this year, and actually intimated that he was in favor of some measure of decriminalization. Now, when he got back home, he kind of pulled back those comments a bit. But I think that, even the really hard-edged conservatives realize that Texas has been locking up too many people and locking up too many people for nonviolent, low-level drug offenses. So there does seem to be a growing bipartisan sentiment for at least rolling back the prison population, opening up alternatives to incarceration. I wish Texas had a ballot initiative option, because then we'd probably legalize medical marijuana there in 2 years. But I will say that DPA is committed to trying to move things forward in Texas.
I appreciate that, Ethan. I'm going to take one more question before I go to another poll question so we can get you all here, and that was going to be you, Thomas, from my own hometown, New York City. Thomas Barton, your mic is live.
Yes, thank you. I work at a major New York City public hospital in the substance abuse clinic offering methadone and buprenorphine. That's by way of foundation. The speaker has really laid out the progress being made in decriminalization of marijuana. But as far as the criminal justice model goes, it also applies in many clinics which offer this service. You have to line up 20 people, go to a window like in a prison or mental hospital. If you are required to do so, you must provide a urine sample with one of us observing you. If you get a positive or two, you may lose days off from coming in the clinic.
Thomas, I'm just going to ask you to just ask your question.
Yeah, the question is, given that criminal justice model of treatment, what focus does the Drug Policy Alliance have in extending the opposition to criminalization into the way clinics purvey services?
Yeah, no, Thomas, that's a great question, and I agree 100% with where you're coming from and your perspective. I should tell you that when I started the organization back in the mid-'90s, we actually had a project on trying to increase access and reduce the stigma with respect to methadone maintenance. And the situation you're describing is outrageous, and it's outrageous in the United States. For the listeners who don't realize this, in many other countries, when people need to get methadone, in terms of, who've been addicted to heroin and where methadone has become their daily medication, and one that in some cases it's going to become a lifelong medication in the same way that for diabetics insulin can be a lifelong medication. In many other countries, you go to your pharmacy, maybe you drink the methadone right there. You basically remove the issue of drugs from your life because the methadone is not making you high anymore. But in the U.S., methadone is among the most stigmatized and segregated forms of medical treatment. There are very few places, New York City is one of the exceptions, where people can actually access methadone maintenance in the correctional system. I mean, you have people who are getting arrested and are in a methadone program or have been addicted to heroin, but then are being deprived of access to their medication, to methadone. So what I can tell you, Thomas, is that we're pushing as hard as we can to reduce the stigma and the barriers so that people can obtain methadone or buprenorphine, or in some cases even pharmaceutical heroin or whatever opioid medication is going to help them reduce their engagement in the street life of illegal addiction. In California right now and in New Mexico, we're doing our best to make methadone available in the correctional setting. We're trying to do that, throughout the rest of the country as well. We're advocates of allowing increased access to buprenorphine, for which, if people don't know on the call, buprenorphine and methadone are both versions of, for people who have been addicted to street heroin, a way to take an alternative medication that removes the craving for heroin. A little bit like what nicotine patches, nicotine chewing gums do for people who have been addicted to cigarettes. So the situation you described is outrageous. One of the best ways we could reduce the size of the market for illegal heroin in this country is by dramatically increasing access to methadone maintenance, to buprenorphine maintenance, to allowing people to get pharmaceutical heroin maintenance as they do in Europe. It's a pivotal part of DPA's mission.
Thanks so much for that, Ethan. I appreciate that answer. And now I want to bring everybody back into the room with a poll question. And the question here is, how satisfied are you with the pace of reform? Please press 1 on your keypad if you are pleasantly surprised at our progress to date. Please press 2 if you think we're about where we should be. Please press 3 if you thought we'd be further along by now. And go ahead and press 4 if you just don't know. Press 1 again if you are just pleasantly surprised at our progress to date. Press 2 if you think we're about where we should be. Press 3 if you thought we'd be further along by now. And press 4 if you don't know or just not sure. And with that poll coming in, Ethan, I wanted to turn to you with a question of my own, because I don't want to sort of get out of here without looking out kind of past the American borders. DPA was, you mentioned Guam earlier, and, you know, we had a hand in that victory, and certainly we were pivotal in the victory in Uruguay, for example, and the UN is now about to hold a special session on drug policy. So can you give us some sort of capsuled understanding of the exciting opportunities for drug policy reform on the international stage, particularly the ones that Americans need to be aware of?
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I'd say about 80 to 90% of DPA's work focuses on the U.S., and obviously changing drug policy in the U.S. has massive international implications. So just as an example, when Colorado and Washington voted to legalize marijuana 2 years ago, that then forced the Obama administration, the Justice Department, to reconsider its perspective on this. When they then announced in August of last year that they were going to give Colorado and Washington a qualified green light to proceed with implementing the marijuana legalization laws, then they were compelled effectively to do the same for foreign governments. So then when Uruguay began the process of setting up a legalization system for marijuana, you saw the U.S. ambassador in the end of last year telling the Uruguayans that this is now no longer a issue for the U.S. government. That the U.S. government, the Obama administration, regarded the legalization of marijuana in Uruguay as entirely a domestic matter for Uruguay. Now, and then that, more recently, resulted in a change for the first time in many, many decades of the U.S. approach with respect to the whole international drug control conventions. I mean, just a few weeks ago, the State Department's top guy on drug policy, a fellow named William Brownfield, you know, former respected diplomat, former ambassador in Colombia and Venezuela, very much identified as a drug war guy, came out and said the U.S. government now has a 4-pillar drug strategy, 2 of which involve a flexible interpretation of the international drug control conventions and tolerance for diverse approaches in dealing with drugs. So there's been an almost monumental historic change in the U.S. global drug policy posture in just the last year. And this means that now, when Jamaica is thinking about legalizing ganja, they have a lot less to fear. When various Caribbean governments are thinking about it, less to fear. In Colombia, there's a medical marijuana bill that's being introduced. Once again, less to fear. Costa Rica talking about it, Chile talking about it, Argentina talking about it, Ecuador moving in the direction of decriminalization. In Canada, if please, God, if we see a change in the national leadership of Canada and the departure of the current Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, and his replacement by Justin Trudeau, we will see a 180 swing on marijuana policy and other drug policy in Canada. And what I can tell, you know, all of you on the call is that DPA has been deeply involved in all of this. I mean, one of my colleagues was in Uruguay virtually all of last year, basically coordinating the public education effort on the marijuana legalization effort. I just got back from Mexico last week, and I'm headed down to Colombia and Jamaica in a few weeks, you know, basically advising senior political figures, including presidents throughout the region. We're helping them draft their laws on medical marijuana. We're trying to push other elements of sentencing reform. So for us, you know, in the sense that drug policy reform is ultimately not just about what we do in our own country, but on some deep level, this is basically a human rights issue. And when you fight for human rights, it's not just about your own country, it's about the world. We're committed to advancing reform all around the world, but especially throughout the Americas.
That's a great answer, Ethan. And as I bring Rodney from Dallas's microphone live, let me share the results of our poll. The majority of you, roughly 45%, are very happy, or surprised at least, at our progress to date, while about 30% of you had sort of hoped we'd be further along. Me too. 14% of you think we're about where we should be, and 11% are still kind of questioning and not sure. But with that said, let me unmute your line, Rodney in Dallas, Texas, and ask you to please present your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for holding this forum. I have one question, and I'll make it very short. Ethan, and let me ask it two ways quickly. How is the analogy between illicit drug prohibition and alcohol prohibition perfect? Is the analogy perfect? Another way to ask the question would be, and somebody who's been involved in this for 20 years should know the answer, but I don't. What would we accept as a totally acceptable solution? Another third way is, what are our final goals? When could Ethan Nadelman sit back and say, we've done it?
That's good.
Great question. Yeah, Ronnie. I mean, first of all, the analogy to alcohol prohibition is the most powerful analogy there really is. Because in a sense, alcohol prohibition was well intended. It looked like it might work in its first few years, and it turned out to be a disaster, where by the end of alcohol prohibition, as many people were drinking as at the beginning, but we had put the whole business in the hands of gangsters and criminals and created massive levels of crime and violence and corruption. And so drug prohibition is like alcohol prohibition with Al Capone and all that, times 50 or 100 in many parts of the world. So in that respect, when I go down to Mexico, it's the first analogy I use, and I've been using it ever since I got involved in this whole issue a long time ago. Now, what's different is that there's no 18th Amendment of alcohol prohibition that can simply be repealed with a 21st Amendment. What's also different is that alcohol was a drug with which the large majority of Americans were familiar, whereas when we're talking about the drugs that are now illegal, roughly half of American adults have tried marijuana, but with respect to the other illegal drugs, there's still people feel like they don't know what those things are about, and their fears can run wild because they don't know about those drugs. Therefore, they imagine the worst. And when medical experts tell them that actually alcohol and tobacco may well be the most dangerous drugs we know of, more dangerous than cocaine, heroin, or methamphetamine, people just find that impossible to believe. So that's the major difference. As far as when I can retire, I'll tell you, when I got started in this back in the late 80s, I basically knew at that time and envisioned this as a three-generation struggle. I oftentimes will say that drug policy reform, that we follow in the footsteps and stand on the shoulders of other movements for personal freedom and social justice, and that just as gay rights and civil rights and women's rights and abolition of slavery were multi-generational struggles, so is ours a multi-generational struggle. I would say that we are now entering the second generation. I'm now in my mid-50s. I hope that, I don't know if I'm going to keep doing this for 5 years or 25 years, but I anticipate that we're going to end up ending marijuana prohibition in this country in coming years. And I don't know if that's going to take 6 years or 20 years, but we're going to do it. I think we are going to end the criminalization of drug possession. And, then I think the ultimate dilemma will be, do we actually get the drug problem in America to be such a small problem that we lose the energy and the passion for ending drug prohibition altogether? Sometimes I look at our allies in Western Europe, and they had a real problem 20 years ago, but they adopted a whole host of pragmatic, harm reduction, public health policies, and the result is that they've turned their drug problems from big problems into small ones. The downside of that is that they've lost some of their passion for basically radically reducing prohibition as much as possible. So I'm figuring 3 generations to go. We're starting the second generation, but let's speed it up as much as we can.
Ethan, my money is on you. I haven't lost me so far. And as I go to our next call, I'm aware that we have only about 20 minutes left. So I'd ask each questioner to please try to capsule their questions. And with that said, I'm very happy to bring Elizabeth Thompson from Pennsylvania on the line. Elizabeth, thank you for calling in, and your line is live.
My question is, do you realize that you're taking on not only the prison system, but the military complex, which has thrived on this war on drugs? And that nothing's ever mentioned about them having so much influence in this war on drugs.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, here's the way I look at it. The prison industrial complex is probably our second most formidable adversary. Our first is simply the pervasive sense of ignorance and fear that pervades popular thinking when it comes to drugs, and people's very visceral fears around their kids, and the fears that drug policy reform will endanger their kids when in fact it would do exactly the opposite. But the prison industrial complex has been really a monstrous opponent. The Prison Guards Union was successful in defeating one of our biggest ballot initiatives back in 2008. I find that the police associations are deeply committed to keeping marijuana illegal. I find that the worst of all actors aren't even driven by money. It's more about power. And those are the district attorneys and prosecutors for whom this is about political power, personal power, criminal justice power. So you're exactly right that these are formidable adversaries, and we need to, but that said, we've had some success in overcoming them. I mean, if you see what just happened in California with the Sentence Reform Initiative, or our victories on marijuana reform, they are not unbeatable. With respect to the military and with respect to the intelligence agencies, the truth is I don't think that those entities are totally committed to the drug war. What's happened is that within the military agencies and the intelligence agencies, they've built up components that are wedded to the drug war and that have their interests. But ultimately, I'm struck by the number of people that I cross paths with who work in or have worked in the national security establishment who feel that they're being compelled to work and focus on the whole drug war when they themselves know it's a futile struggle and when they'd rather be focused on greater threats to U.S. security. So I ultimately don't see the whole U.S. security apparatus as our major opponent. I see more elements of the bureaucratic apparatus in the security agencies as a problem. The prison industrial complex, different story.
Thanks so much, Ethan. And I'm going to go to Reverend Mike Young in California. Reverend Young, your microphone is now live.
Hi, I'm Reverend Mike Young, and I'm one of the only people who was involved in the Good Friday Marsh Chapel experiment that was for years and years willing to talk to the public. In the meantime, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies has succeeded in getting research projects involved with the use of Schedule I drugs in therapeutic situations. What's your orientation about that one?
Yeah, no, I mean, I should say that with respect to the issue of psychedelics and making them more legally available, certainly for medical and scientific and religious purposes, and in some respects more broadly, it's something that is core to our principles. But that, Rick Doblin and MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, has been doing such a great job, as has the Hefter Institute. They're both our allied organizations. DPA recently co-published a report with MAPS about the ways in which the U.S. DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, has been blocking research. So we're very much committed. What I will say is that I'm increasingly intrigued by what's happening with ayahuasca. And for those of you who don't know, ayahuasca is a powerful psychoactive substance from the Amazon, something resembling peyote and the role of peyote among Native American communities and others. But there are a couple of churches where ayahuasca is a sacrament. The U.S. Supreme Court has recognized the First Amendment constitutional right to use ayahuasca as part of these ceremonies. But what's interesting is the number of stories I'm now hearing about ayahuasca being used really all around the world. Quiet ceremonies happening, sometimes in the Catholic tradition, sometimes with shamanic practices, very rarely being used simply as, let's just take it and drop some ayahuasca and have some fun. And I think there's something bigger going on around that. I think that when people ask what drugs other than marijuana are candidates for full legal regulation, I think that some of these powerful psychedelic substances, for lack of a better term, are candidates. The fact that it's virtually impossible to get addicted to substances like, mushrooms, mescaline, peyote, ayahuasca, is a powerful reason to give them a lot more respect. I think in terms of talking about the positive elements of psychoactive drug use, that the evidence, including really good studies coming out of Johns Hopkins and other places about the medicinal and spiritual benefits of these substances, I think that makes it interesting and important. So for Drug Policy Alliance, working on the psychedelics has not been a priority for us relative to reducing prison population and ending marijuana prohibition and treating addiction as a health issue, but it's very much part of our own DNA, and I think you're going to see us doing more work on this front in years to come.
Thanks so much, Ethan. Let me lob in here a question of my own about something that's come up with a number of advocates I've spoken to recently, and it's about asset forfeiture, which at different times has played a different role in the national dialogue around drug policy reform. Do you see it? I'm wondering, is this cropping up as something we should turn our attention to? It seems to me, from my vantage point, it is, but I'd like your thoughts on that before we go to the next question.
Asha, thanks for raising that question. I mean, I'll tell you something. This issue of asset forfeiture, most Americans say that, if you steal something, you should lose it. You should forfeit your property, right? But the large majority of Americans think there's something fundamentally wrong with civil asset forfeiture. They hate the fact that the police or the prosecutors can seize an individual's property, right, and keep it without a criminal conviction. And they also hate the fact that when the law enforcement agencies keep it, they actually keep it for their own agencies. It doesn't go to the general treasury or what have you. So we got active on this issue back in the late 90s. We actually drafted and won 2 ballot initiatives in Utah and in Oregon back in 2000 to pull back on these asset forfeiture abuses. And then the issue kind of died down for years. But I'll tell you, it's coming back with a vengeance right now. I mean, for those of you who want to know more about this issue, the Washington Post did 2 great, front-page stories on the issue in the last month or two. The New Yorker magazine by the journalist, I think her name's Sarah Stillman, did a great piece on this last year. And the easiest thing I would say is John Oliver, the guy on, who was with Jon Stewart, just did a fantastic 20-minute riff on asset forfeiture, which is, it was about the best summation I've ever seen of the issue. So for DPA, we are increasingly re-engaging with the issue of the asset forfeiture abuses by police and prosecutors. The other thing I'd say is that when this issue was, people were paying attention in the late 90s, 2000s, nobody was paying attention to the ways in which the asset forfeiture is disproportionately targeted at poor people and people of color. And what you see now is just that with other elements of the drug war and with arrests from marijuana to other drugs to incarceration, the ways in which young men and poor people, and especially people of color, and especially African Americans, are disproportionately targeted, arrested, prosecuted, convicted, incarcerated, that same fun drug offenses, that same issue plays out with asset forfeiture. So we're looking at the possibility of ballot initiatives, maybe in Arizona. We're looking at the possibility of legislation in states ranging from California, New Mexico, to other places. We're looking on Capitol Hill, where Senator Rand Paul has introduced a bill to reform federal asset forfeiture laws. So this is another issue that is really looming large as an emerging DPA priority for the rest of the decade.
Thanks for that, Ethan. And with that, I'm going to turn to Oregon, and I'm going to bring your microphone live. This is Pat in Oregon. Congratulations, by the way. And I think you have a question that goes beyond the borders of your state, yes?
Yeah, the thing that bothers me is all these people that are getting killed because of these drug lords and so forth. And so what I was wondering about is if we should legalize all drugs, has the Drug Alliance given any thought to putting infrastructure in place to deal with all drug addicts? And how would they go about doing that? And what have they done in Europe? Is this
yeah?
You've got my question.
Yeah. Well, Pat, I partially answered this question before, the best way to think about drug policy reform and about even drug policy is to imagine all of the policy options as arrayed along a spectrum, from the most draconian, cut off, your fingers, whip you, hang you like they do in Saudi Arabia or Singapore, what have you, to the most free market approaches. Basically, imagine what the cigarette policy was back in the 60s with minimal controls, except maybe access for kids. And what we're trying to do, what Drug Policy Alliance is trying to do, is to move U.S. and, for that matter, global drug policy as much as possible down the spectrum, away from the draconian policies, to decriminalize, to squeeze criminalization out of drug policy as much as possible, but stopping short at the point at which we think that going any further would actually result in significant increases in drug addiction or any threats to public safety or, increases in crime. So what we look at is, in the U.S., remarkable as it seems, the U.S. is actually leading the world now and becoming a role model for the sensible, implementation of marijuana reform, first with medical and now with respect to legal regulation. So the rest of the world is to some extent looking to us, and we've effectively leapfrogged the Dutch, and now you see the Europeans, in Spain and Switzerland, Denmark, Czech Republic, the Netherlands all saying, whoa, what just happened here? All of a sudden the U.S. leapfrogged us and Uruguay as well. With the other drugs, as I said before, part of what they've done, Portugal's been a model for ending the criminalization of drug possession. They basically changed their law about 12, 13 years ago, and they said, we're not putting anybody in jail for drug possession. Their basic view is you get caught for drugs, we're going to figure out, do you really have a problem? If you don't, go away. If you do have a problem, let's try to help you. But we're not going to drug test you and torture you until you stop. And if you're really a bad guy, we'll catch you for something else. And then the other thing is what the Swiss did beginning 20 years ago, and now the Dutch and the Germans and the Danes and the British, all basically saying, if you're addicted to heroin and you haven't been able to quit with methadone or buprenorphine, well, then come to this clinic and we'll give you legal heroin and other services. And that's proved very effective. The big policy challenge for the next 2 decades and our best hope of reducing the black market for heroin and other opiates and for other drugs as well, and drying up the markets for the narco traffickers and all that stuff, is going to be taking what the Europeans are doing with heroin maintenance and finding the best ways to scale it up without endangering the broader public health. So that's about the best answer I can give you. I realize it's not the flat-out legalize-it-all answer, but I think realistically speaking, that's going to be the way we need to go.
Thank you so much, Ethan. And let me take this question from Al, and then we're going to begin to wrap up, although there will be other ways for us to be able to hear your question. So, Al from New Jersey, your mic is now live.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm with the Unitarian Universalist Legislative Ministry here in New Jersey, and although I am very strongly for decriminalization of all drugs, our main concern is with reform of the criminal justice system and an end to mass incarceration. And in that respect, I would like to know how we would handle and deal with the corporate takeover and development of large corporations to monopolize the distribution of drugs that seems to be developing in Colorado, for example. And
let me stop you. Let me ask you to bring it to a close there, because we're almost out of time, Al, and I don't want to miss you. So, how do big corporations, or how should we deal with big corporations in the marijuana industry? Is that a fair summary? Thank you, Ethan.
Well, yeah, sorry to be so abrupt on this, but let me just say 2 things. First of all, when it comes to the issue of taking on sort of corporate or business influence, interesting, New Jersey became this year a model for how you take on the bail bond industry. If ever there was a venal industry of people who make their money off of locking up and keeping jail populations large, it's those guys. And we have an office in New Jersey, a remarkable director, Roseanne Scotti, who took on the bail bond industry, fought them tooth and nail through the legislative process, got Governor Christie finally on board, beat them through the legislature, and then we won the ballot initiative on Election Day. So it is possible to take on the big corporate forces. With respect to the other part of your question, I think, which is how do we avoid having the kind of, Marlboroization or Budweiserization of marijuana that might come with legalization, it's an issue I'm really torn about, because my preference would be to have us legalize marijuana and have what you might call the microbrewery model, or what you might call the vineyard model, something like the wine model, right? I think that that would be an optimal model. On the other hand, I know that this is America. We are a remarkably dynamic, capitalist society for better and for worse. We don't do very well. We tend to either prohibit things or legalize it 24/7 and just roll the dice on everything. We're not very good at designing middle ground social policies. I think in the foreseeable future, one of the silver linings on the federal government not legalizing marijuana, requiring the states to do this, what it means is that a lot of the marijuana industry is staying sort of state-focused. It's staying relatively small. And so long as there's state legislation, sometimes they're requiring limits on how big these things can be. So DPA is committed, as a matter of good public policy, to trying to avoid the broader Marlboroization or Budweiserization of marijuana. We're hopeful that there are certain things about marijuana that are going to prevent it becoming Marlboroized or Budweiserized. But I have to say that if down the road, if you ultimately give me the choice, Ethan, you want to continue with the prohibition of marijuana and 700,000 people being arrested each year and keeping this in the hands of the black market and people being killed and hurt and environmental problems and all of that, or do you want to have a world in which corporate players dominate the marijuana industry? I would say that corporate domination of a legal marijuana market is the lesser evil compared to criminalization. What we're fighting for is a responsible legal policy that stops short of mass corporatization, but unfortunately there's no way to promise that that will be the outcome a generation from now.
Thank you so much, Ethan. And, in our dwindling moments here, I want to remind everybody that, Ethan did this amazing talk in Brazil, a TED Talk on global drug policy, and just truly it is the most succinct and clear presentation about the human rights catastrophe that's otherwise known as the drug war. You can listen to it at drugpolicy.org/TED and share it with others who need the best primer on why we need to end this drug war. And with that said, Ethan, I'd like you to just sort of take us out tonight thinking about DPA's priorities as we look forward to the next year, 2 years, 5 years in drug policy reform. What are DPA's priorities, and what do you want this audience to know?
Okay, thanks so much, Asha. Thanks so much for moderating this call with me. I mean, look, first of all, DPA is going to play the leadership role in all likelihood in California in terms of legalizing marijuana in 2016. I've made a commitment to that. We're going to make this effort as inclusive as possible, come up with the best possible initiative that's both winnable and that advantages the maximum number of people in California. We're going to play a assisting role with a whole range of other legalization initiatives around the country. We're going to keep pushing forward on medical marijuana and decriminalizing that. But separately, we're at least as committed to ending the criminalization of drug possession and rolling back the incarceration. And that means reducing the penalties for drug sales. It means stopping the incarceration of people for simple drug possession. It means a true commitment to trying to deal with drug use and addiction as health issues. It means we want to pass these 911 Good Samaritan laws all around the country to try to reduce. Those you don't know, more people died of an overdose fatality last year than died of a car accident. It's the number one cause of accidental deaths in America now. And so, most of the media we get is around the marijuana issue, but we're just as committed to trying to reduce the harms associated with drug misuse. Meanwhile, we want to help our allies in the Caribbean and throughout Latin America push this issue forward as well. We're planning for a great big United Nations General Assembly special session on drugs in 2016, and we want to try to shift the global dynamic around that. We're working with former presidents of countries in Latin America, Europe, on the Global Commission on Drug Policy to really help open up this debate. And as I said on this call, on issues like reforming policy around psychedelics, moving into broader asset forfeiture reform, those are emerging priorities for DPA as well. And basically trying to reduce both the racial injustice and the human injustice that goes with this monstrous war on drugs. For all of you on the call, I'm so grateful for your taking the time tonight to call in. I'm grateful for the fact that you've supported DPA. Please don't let the year end without making a contribution to support our work. And if you can do it, give a bigger contribution than you ever have before. But mostly I'm grateful for the level of interest that you showed by staying with us on this call for the full hour. Asha, thanks so much for hosting this call, and I'll let you wrap up.
Well, Ethan, I couldn't wrap up any better than you did right there. I want to apologize to those whose questions we did not get to tonight. They are important to us. You'll be prompted by a voicemail at the end of this so that we can hear them, and you'll be hearing from us in myriad ways going forward. And let me thank everybody who made this call possible on the technical side, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. And thank you for all you do to support DPA. These victories are truly your victories. That said, a good night to you all.